All right, let's review parts 1 through 4. Are you ready? We're gonna hit those first ones pretty briefly, but then we're gonna focus in on the last couple here. Here's the first question. Fill in the blanks and name the clause and constitutional reference. The Constitution and the laws of the United States. Blank, blank, blankety, blank, blank, okay? Which shall be made in pursuance thereof. Yep, shall be the supreme law of the land. Excellent. Now, what's the clause? What's the reference? Well, the name of the clause is the Supremacy Clause, and the reference is Article 6, Clause 2. Good job. Okay, next question. The General Welfare Clause is based on the following idea. Fill in the blank. If it's not blank, you blank do it. If it's not listed, you can't do it. Excellent. Good job. Next question. The general welfare powers are listed in which article, section, and clauses? So the Article 1, should know Section 8. Which clauses? 2 through 9 and 17. Okay, those are the general welfare clauses. Now, fill in the blank. Okay, this is the 10th Amendment. Awesome amendment. The blank not delegated to the United States are reserved to the blank respectively or to the blank. Got it? The what? The powers not delegated to the United States are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Good. All right, next question. Explain the significance of the highlighted portion of the clause below. Ready? For carrying into execution the foregoing powers. For carrying into execution the foregoing powers. Explain that significance. Say it out loud. Write it down. Okay? It needs to go from just I'm watching this to I'm participating in this. Okay? What do you think? What is the significance of the phrase for carrying into execution the foregoing powers? Here's my answer, okay? Your answer, I'm sure, will be similar. Congress can make laws that are not listed in Article 1, Section A, but only if those things are necessary in order to carry out the specific list of things they can do which are listed in Article 1, Section 8. They must tie directly into the specific list of power. They can't just be determined to be necessary and proper on their own, as determined by government. Okay, this question. What are the foregoing powers referred to in the necessary and proper clause? Okay? Makes sense? What are the, when they're talking about foregoing powers, what are they referring to? Which ones? Well, the ones that are just listed, right? The foregoing powers, the ones that are just listed in Article 1, Section 8, clauses 2 through 17. Okay? And the follow-up question there is, why is this important in terms of self-government? Why does it matter that it's talking about the foregoing powers? Why does that matter in terms of self-governance, this principle that we govern ourselves? Here's my idea, my response. What happens is it puts the people in charge of deciding what's necessary and proper because they listed the powers they delegated to Congress. It's not up to government to decide for us what's necessary and proper. It's up to us, right? That's important because then necessary and proper clause can't be abused. Okay, here's the next question. Circle the correct definition of an implied power. A, directly given and listed, or B, indirectly suggested. What's an implied power? Yep, you're right. It's letter B. It's an indirectly suggested power. Follow-up question, are there any powers granted to Congress that aren't specifically listed in Article 1, Section 8? Yes or no? Yes, there are. Okay, now explain. Explain to me, how does that work, that there are powers that aren't actually listed? You're right, there are powers Congress has that aren't specifically listed, but those implied powers have to be necessary in order to carry out the specifically listed powers. All right? Okay, kind of some technical stuff there. What we're trying to do is get you into the principles, the ideas behind this, not just the rote memorization. Okay. Speaking of rote memorization, now we're going to review the memorization of the necessary and proper clause. You ready? Okay. The Congress shall have power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. Good job. All right, remind me, Interstate Commerce Clause, ICC, yep, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3, ICC 183, right? Good, okay, let's get moving here. Just a good 10,000 foot view here. Remember, we're in Article 1, Section 8. This is one of the listed powers referred to in the General Welfare Power or referred to in the Necessary and Proper Clause that's listed for Congress to be able to do, a specific enumerated or listed power, okay? Let's get into some definitions. We like to talk about those. Interstate commerce. Let's talk about the word interstate. What does inter mean? Well, inter actually is a prefix that means across or between. Okay? as opposed to the prefix intra. Intra means inside of or within. Okay, inter means across or between. Intra means inside. Now, when you look at this interstate, okay, interstate means then across state lines, in between states, whereas intrastate means inside, within a state. So let's take an example. Here's a map of the United States, and we have an interstate highway. What would an interstate look like? An interstate would look like a road that goes all the way across America, right? I-80, I don't know if you knew this, I-80 goes through Wyoming, where I live. It goes, I think, from New York all the way to California. It's this huge interstate, okay? I-80, Interstate 80. Whereas if you look at an intrastate highway, Interstate 220, Wyoming 220 is a road, a highway that goes just within. It's intrastate. It's just inside of the state, okay? So when we're talking, the reason we're defining this, try to understand what this word interstate means. Interstate Commerce Clause. Interstate means across state lines, okay? Now, just for a little more detail to get some depth here, interpersonal, not just interstate, but interpersonal. What would interpersonal mean? Wouldn't it mean between two or more people, right? Between people. Whereas intrapersonal would mean within an individual person, okay? So clearly, the Interstate Commerce Clause has to do with those things which are across state lines. So let's throw those four definitions together, okay? Interstate means between or across state lines. Intrastate means within a single state. Interpersonal means between people, and intrapersonal means within an individual person, okay? Clearly, the Interstate Commerce Clause doesn't have to do with interpersonal, doesn't have to be intrapersonal, and it isn't intrastate, it's simply interstate, okay? Interstate Commerce Clause has to do those things happening in between the states, that's it. Not within a state, not in between people, not within a single person. That has nothing to do with the Interstate Commerce Clause. Interstate Commerce Clause is just the interaction between the states. Okay, so get those definitions there. Okay, now we're going to get to our analogy, the analogy we always use, right? The car and mechanic shop. The car represents the people in the states, and the mechanic shop represents the federal government, okay? We're going to take this analogy one step further. We're not going to say the car owner, just the people in the states. We're going to define a single state. We're going to say the car owner represents Wyoming, all right? And we're going to introduce another character in this, and that's going to be this third person who is the car buyer, and we're going to say this car buyer is Colorado, all right? So we've introduced a new character, kind of defined our characters a little bit more here. So here's what's happening. Wyoming wants to sell their car, okay? Put a for sale sign, hey, anyone want to buy this car here? And Colorado comes along and says, sure, we want to buy it. We got a car seller and a car buyer. So what would a car buyer typically do? A car buyer is going to ask, hey, how well does that run? Okay, how well does your car run? And the car seller is going to say, well, it runs great. Thanks for asking, right? Car buyer then asks, how do you know? How do you know it runs well? And the car seller is going to say, well, you have my word on it. It's a good car. So the car buyer says, well, that's nice to have your word on it, but have you run any tests on it? And the car seller says, oh, sure, I run tests on it. I stick my ear next to the hood and listen. And if it sounds good, it's a good car. Okay? How would that make you feel as a car buyer? Maybe not so good. Well, is there something else we can do here? Is there something we can do to make sure it's a good car? Yeah, there is, isn't there? We can run it against a standardized test. Can we do that? You bet. Okay? So let's look at a hypothetical standardized test, all right? Okay, here it is. We're basically going to take this car to a mechanic shop and say, okay, run it. Run this test with these different standards, okay? And on the first little item here, he gets a 98%. On the next one, we get out of 152, score 124, etc., etc., okay? So you go through this whole test and you find out grand total on the standardized test, out of 10, the score is 8.6. This car is an 8.6 on a scale of 1 to 10, okay? That way, both the car buyer and the car seller know, look, this is what the test shows this car to be, what type of car this is, what quality of car this is. Now, what was important for this to happen is that the person who ran the standardized test had to be a third party. They had to be a disinterested party. What if the car seller ran the test? Well, they say, well, it's a 10 out of 10, right? The car buyer said, no, it's a 2 out of 10, right? You need to have a third party. That third party is the mechanic shop. The mechanic shop isn't trying to win or score points with anybody. They're just simply saying, here's we run it against a standardized test, okay? It's an 8.6 out of 10. Now, that's fairly similar to this idea of the Interstate Commerce Clause. Here's what it says. The Congress shall have power to regulate commerce among the several states. Okay, so there's the Interstate Commerce Clause. Let's look at some of the words, right? Let's break it down and define some of these words. The first word we're going to define is regulate. What's it mean to regulate? Okay, to regulate means to keep regular, to make the rules, right? To set a standard for. Okay, just like the mechanic shop, they had a standardized test. To regulate means to set the standard, right? Now, the next word is commerce. What does commerce mean? Commerce is really simply the buying and selling of goods. Okay, that's what commerce is. It's the buying and selling of things. And lastly, let's look at this word among. What's among mean? We already kind of talked about it in Interstate, right? Among means between. Let's do what we've done in other presentations. Let's take the definitions and plug them into the actual words, okay? So, Congress shall have power to regulate. Let's throw in to set a standard for. Commerce, let's throw in buying and selling. And among, in between. The Congress shall have power to set a standard for buying and selling in between the several states, right? They're in charge of setting those standards for the selling and buying and selling that happens between the states. Pretty simple, that's what it says. Now, let's open up your Constitution and let's highlight this, okay? Let's go to what? Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3. Okay, so we're going to take and highlight that with our pink highlighter. Ready? Go ahead and highlight that. Push pause if you need to. Highlight that to Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3. Notice we're going to skip some of the words there. To regulate commerce among the several states. That's the Interstate Commerce Clause. Just like it shows here in the example. Okay? All right, now that it's highlighted, let's write some notes in there so we don't forget, okay? What does regulate mean again? Let's circle regulate and write in there to set a standard, right? Now let's circle commerce and let's write in the definition of buying and selling. Okay. Now let's circle among and write in there in between. And then in parentheses write not within a state nor between people. Okay. So you remember, interstate means in between states, not within a state or between people. Okay? Got those written down there? All right, you're putting your notes in here so you can have this Constitution know exactly what we've talked about. It's your own cheat sheet here for you. That reminds me of a game. Okay, we have to have an activity here, right? Get some blood pumping again. This game is called Poison Stump. This is the favorite. This is one everyone loves. Okay, the way this works is simply you get like a rubber trash can or something. Okay, you stick it in the middle, turn it upside down, and everyone gets in a circle and holds hands. And then you say go, and you try to pull someone and make someone hit that trash can. Then they're out. Okay? Now, if you're pulling and two people slip and they let go, those two people are out, whoever lost their hands as well. Okay? So you start out like 10 people. Well, anyway, I'll just show you. It's fun. What we learned by that game is interstate. The only way to play that game is if you're all interlocked, right? If it's something happening between you and among you, that's the only way to play the game. You can't play the game unless you're holding hands. You have to hold hands. Okay, so that's the application to Interstate Commerce Clause. Okay? Awesome. Okay, let's apply the analogy, right? Who does Congress represent? Or who represents Congress? The mechanic shop, right? And then who represents the several states? The Wyoming and Colorado in this case? Well, the car buyer and the car seller. Okay, so let's reread it. The mechanic shop shall have power to set a standard for buying and selling in between the car seller and the car buyer. That makes sense? Yeah, they're setting the standard. Let's apply that though. Let's look at this. Okay, let's set that up here on top of our slide and then talk about some things. Does this mean the mechanic shop gets to tell the state of Wyoming, you must sell your car and you must sell it for $8,792? Is that what that means? No, that's not what it means. You can't do that, right? Or does that mean that the mechanic shop can tell Colorado, you must buy that car and you must buy it for $8,792? That's not true either. It's not true on two counts, right? They can't force the sale to happen and they can't force the price at which the sale will happen. Okay? So you got to understand the mechanic shop's role. The mechanic shop doesn't have anything to do with the sell. Doesn't have anything to do with the decision. They only have to do with the setting the standard to say this car is 8.6 out of 10. That's it. Okay? They're setting the rules in between the states. That's all. Right? Just like the federal government sets the rules, but they don't control the states. They don't make the states do certain things. They simply set the rules for the states. They set the standard, okay? Now, who gets to decide at what price, who gets to decide if they sell the car and if they buy the car and at what price? Wyoming and Colorado, right? The states do, okay? So Wyoming comes along and says, hey, I'll sell it to you for $8,000, for $8,000. And Colorado says, how about we sell it for $7,000? Wyoming says, no, how about $7,800? And Colorado can say, well, how about $7,400? And Wyoming says, okay, fine, sold. $7,400 it is, okay? They write that check out to the state of Wyoming and sign it. Good to go, hand it to Wyoming, and what's Wyoming say? Hey, thanks, but you also owe me the $1,000 Colorado fee. Colorado says, Colorado fee? What are you talking about? And Wyoming says, yeah, we in Wyoming figure Colorado should pay us for the privilege of doing business with us. Colorado kind of looks dubiously at him. Come on, you charge me $1,000 just because I'm Colorado? And he said, yeah, pretty slick, huh? Nice way to get some money into our state. And Colorado says, you gotta be kidding me. You can't do that. Yeah, we can. We're in charge of whatever happens in our state. We can do whatever we want to in Wyoming. Well, Colorado says, fine. Well, I'm not gonna buy the car from you then. What's more, anytime Wyoming comes and tries to buy anything in Colorado, we're gonna charge you $2,000 as a Wyoming fee. How do you like that? So what's gonna happen here? Wyoming says, well, I'm not ever going to buy anything from you then. I'm never going to go to Colorado and buy things. What happens to commerce? What happens to the buying and selling in this case? It completely shuts down, right? Because they both are gouging each other and trying to get fees that have nothing to do with the selling and buying of the goods. They're just trying to add a bunch of fees so they can collect money in their states. Believe it or not, this is exactly what was happening in 1787 when they were forming the Constitution. States were gouging each other and setting fees upon each other, and commerce is completely coming to a halt. There's all kinds of problems. So what they did is the wise founders said, we can't have this happen. We need to give power to a third party so that one state and another state won't argue and just completely beat each other up. Let's give power to a third party, and that third party was the federal government. And they gave them the power to set the rules, not to control the states, but to set the rules between the states so they couldn't put fees on each other, and commerce would continue to flourish, and we could survive, right, economically. That makes sense? That's a good idea, isn't it? Now, just in case we missed it, they talked about this in another part of the Constitution as well. We're not going to memorize this or spend too much time on this, but in Article 1, Section 10, Clause 2, it says this: no state shall, without the consent of Congress, lay any imposts or duties on imports or exports, okay? Now, lay any imposts or duties, that's simply a big fancy word for saying collect any state fees, okay? What's imports and exports? Imports is stuff that comes into the state, exports is stuff that goes out of the states. So they can't lay any fees on that stuff, okay? So we're going to substitute products entering or leaving the state. So no state shall, without the consent of Congress, collect any state fees on products entering or leaving the state. That's what Article 1, Section 10, Clause 2 repeated, and it's solidified there. Exactly what's being said in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3. There's also one other place where it talks about that. It must have been something important to the founders, okay? Because Article 1, Section 9, Clause 6 says, nor shall vessels bound to or from one state be obliged to enter, clear, or pay duties in another. What does that mean? Well, let's just take that and just say it in simple terms, okay? And no trucks or ships that are going to or from a state can be forced to pay fees just for being in that state, okay? So it's a third witness here, third time that it says, no, you can't do that. You can't just say, well, you're in our state, so you must pay this fee because you're in our state. No, that's not freedom. That will slow things up. It'll keep things, instead of being regular and flowing, it'll stop things from happening. There'll be no more commerce that occurs, okay? James Monroe says, a power to prevent any fees on the trade between the states was the only power granted. Okay, I threw in the word fees there to kind of modernize what he's saying, but a power to prevent any fees on the trade between the states was the only power granted. That's what he's saying. The Interstate Commerce Clause, that all that did was allow Congress to disallow the states from putting fees on each other so that commerce could flourish. Makes sense, doesn't it? Makes perfect sense. Back to our definitions of the Interstate Commerce Clause. The Congress shall have power to set a standard for buying and selling in between the several states. Nowadays, there's some changes to some of these words, what people think these things mean. Commerce is still the same. It's still buying and selling, okay? We still have commerce defined as that. But regulate, instead of being to set a standard for, what it's now interpreted as is to make all decisions about buying and selling. Not just to set a standard for buying and selling, but to make all decisions about buying and selling. And this word among not only means in between the several states, but they've added and inside each one of the states. And let's add one more thing, and in between all people and over each individual. Okay? So this Interstate Commerce Clause that used to be just interstate, just between the states, now is defined as being the Congress has power to make all decisions about buying and selling in between the several states and inside each one of the states and in between all people and over each individual. Is that an expansion of what the Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3 clearly said and meant in the original Constitution, the original intent for constitutions? You bet. It's very much an expansion. It expands government. There's so many problems right now because Interstate Commerce Clause is interpreted as this instead of as what it really says in plain English that we can read ourselves. So back to the slide where we had just the one thing that was circled, right? It has this green circle around it. Well, our problem is it's now intrastate, and it's now interpersonal, and it's now interpersonal. The interstate commerce clause could pretty much be called the intrastate commerce clause, the interpersonal commerce clause, intrapersonal commerce clause. That's not what it is, though. Then we get an example of why that matters. Okay, here's a map of the United States. We have Washington, D.C. with this yellow star, and then here we have the state of Wyoming. Because of the way that it's being interpreted, the Interstate Commerce Clause says, okay, well, we in D.C., and we in the Congress we're gonna tell a farmer what he can grow on his own land. We're gonna tell him who he can sell it to. We're gonna tell him who he can hire. We're gonna tell him how much he must pay his employees. We're gonna tell him what his employees can do. We're gonna tell him what products he must buy. We're gonna tell him what price he has to pay for those products. Does that sound right? Does that sound like that farmer's free to do as he pleases? No, okay? Those decisions are not to be made by DC. Those decisions are to be made by the farmer. There may even be a role for the state to make some decisions as far as regulating and making rules about commerce, but not inside the state, not the farmer inside the state, not the farmer himself, nor what happens inside that state. Only with the buying and selling that goes across state lines. So you can see how that's a total usurpation. That's a big word for grabbing of power by DC, by Congress, doing those things they haven't been authorized to do. Okay, so before we get to the memorization, let's talk about another activity. But really, I can't explain it to you. I'm just going to have to show you how it works, okay? So here it is. Here we go. Settled in? Now we're going to memorize the Interstate Commerce Clause. Remember, read it with me. That's the key. You have to read it over and over. That repetition will get it into your brain. Here we are. The Congress shall have power to regulate commerce among the several states. The Congress shall have power to regulate commerce among the several states. The Congress shall have power to regulate commerce among the several states. Congress shall have power to regulate commerce among the several states. And then the last one, all the blanks, ready? The Congress shall have power to regulate commerce among the several states. Okay, there you got it. Another memorized clause from the 5 clauses that everyone should know in the Constitution.